And welcome to the ResearchWorks podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the ResearchWorks podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast.
Yes, welcome back, everyone. We hope you're having a good week, and we are so happy that you have tuned in to our humble little podcast again today.
Yes.
Because we have a wonderful guest, and I think I'm going to take some liberties and call him a friend of the podcast.
100%.
Because he has joined us for one of our most listened to episodes.
Yes, indeed.
And I'm drawing it out for building suspense. Welcome, Professor Andrew Whitehouse.
Oh,
Welcome.
I'm definitely a friend. If you'll be a friend of me, I'm a friend of yours. Absolutely. Yeah.
I love it. Thank you for coming back. I mean, that's a big thing. First is getting them on the show to start off with.
Yep.
And he came on the show right at the beginning when we just started.
Yeah.
So, we were kind of just, nothing much had been happening.
No.
Yeah, so
we didn't have as many lights in the studio as we do now.
That's right.
Yeah.
We actually have a studio now.
We have a studio.
You have
It's
plants
soundproof.
in the studio. It's
Yeah,
even better.
we have plants.
Yeah.
I know. It's all a little bit techie.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming back, though, Andrew.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I love this. And I know that, whenever you talk, people always walk away feeling much richer. And I know I feel that all the time. So I know that when people listen to this conversation, the pearls of wisdom that you're going to impart, and that's, I think people are going to definitely be thinking deeply about their practices. So I'm really excited.
Thank you so much. No, I mean, it's a thrill to be here. It's funny you talk about wisdom, and I think we'll talk about this throughout the podcast, but so much of the wisdom happens when you're talking with families.
Yeah.
That we bring part, they bring part, and together that's where the wisdom happens.
Yep.
So I hope I can hold up my end of the bargain today.
God.
Let's give it a shot.
Let's see.
I'm pretty confident that you can. So today we're going to talk with Andrew on the topic of how much is the right amount of therapy. And this has stemmed because you published a blog on the Clinic Kids website on this topic, and we thought it'd be a really good opportunity to have you come and join us in the studio and talk about this really important subject that is backed up by a body of evidence.
Yep.
And it's something that comes up, I think, all the time these days. It's very topical at the moment, obviously in the autism space, but I think in child health more broadly.
I think so too. Yep.
100%. It's a constant front of mind for families, which means that it's a source of anxiety, guilt, and genuine intrigue. So it's so great we're talking about the elephant in the room.
Yeah. But before we get stuck into that, we need to tell our listeners a little bit more about you, Andrew. So Andrew is the Angela Wright Bennett Professor of Autism Research at the Telethon Kids Institute and Professor of Autism Research at the University of Western Australia. He's also the Director of Clinic Kids, Research Strategy Director of the Cooperative Research Centre for Living with Autism, or the Autism CRC, and Adjunct Professor at Curtin University and Edith Cowan University. Andrew is the current President of the Australasian Society for Autism Research. The aim of Andrew's research and team of researchers is to support young children and their families to reach their full potential through the development and translation of cutting-edge evidence-based practice.
Oh, that's a good one.
Get a life, Whitehouse. God.
That's a pretty busy life by the
Oh,
sounds of it.
come on, how boring.
No, not at all. But I think, wrapped up in that introduction is a lot of really important work that you and your team do. So
Totally. So absolutely. It's me here, but there's a million people that's contributed to that.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it.
So, Andrew, the podcast has evolved a little bit since you were last in the studio, given that you were one of our first guests. So we have added the little icebreaker question to our format. So this is the first time that you get to experience the icebreaker question before we get stuck into the nitty-gritty of this blog. So if you could watch one movie again for the first time, what would it be and why?
Oh, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because, I must have seen hundreds. I have to say, you know how we all have a childhood movie that we watched on repeat, and people of my vintage, it was a VHS, and you get
from
all those.
Blockbuster.
That's right.
Yeah.
So for me, it was The Karate Kid, and I don't know if you've ever watched it as an adult. It holds up very well. Now the reasons are number one. Number one, everyone loves an inspirational kind of sporting story, and that sort of good prevailing over evil. Is a fabulous sort of element of that story. But I think perhaps as an adult, you start to see subtle themes that I'm not even sure that the filmmakers knew were there. So I'm reading a bit into this. But the sort of paint the fence, wash the car, paint the house, the notion that we do so much work and that it only comes together on the 100th try because of the 99 before. I think that is exactly a message that we could and should impart to ourselves as our colleagues, our kids and everyone around us, that if anything happens, it's only because of the 99 times that you gave it a shot beforehand. So did I read something deep into something that's really just entertainment?
That's so good.
Totally.
That was an emphatic justification for why. So I love it. Yes.
Definite pass. Oh, that was a good movie. All right, for me, I would say it's around the same sort of era. It would be Back to the Future.
Oh, yes.
Oh, when you watch it again as an adult and you go back and you watch it, same thing, it holds up. But can you imagine what it would have felt like the first time seeing like the car fly and the lightning bolts and the traveling? It was so magical. It was like probably the first time I felt like I was just transported in this amazing place. Things that you might normally read just came to life. And I really, really loved that one.
Yeah,
Back to
second
the Future.
that.
Such a good film.
Yeah.
What about you, Ash?
Well, I thought about this a lot. And I think I had to, in the end, go with The Lion King.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason for that is because I cannot enjoy the first half of that movie now, knowing what happens in the second half. Spoiler alert.
It's so true.
When Mufasa dies.
Oh.
And it's like, what happens? So it's too emotional. I can't enjoy the big opening, song and dance because I'm like, oh,
because you know what's happening. Yeah, true.
It's just, it's tainted with sadness now. So I'd like to just go back and watch that again.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I remember when I watched Lion King musical. Yeah. And that whole thing is really amazing. But as it all happens, you're like, oh no, it's going to be so tragic.
It just like looms over you. Yeah.
I like it.
Anyway, sorry to end things on a slightly morbid note.
That's all right. And Scar doesn't prevail. So,
yes.
That's
true.
Yes. Just coming back to the
there we go.
Good prevailing over.
Love.
Yep. So let's move on to slightly less frivolous topics. Andrew, it's been a few years now since we had you on the podcast. I know that you and your team have been incredibly busy since then. The last time we spoke, we were talking about the synthesis of research evidence that was published back in November 2020 on interventions for children on the autism spectrum. Can you talk about how your body of work has kind of evolved since then and what direction you've been going in?
Absolutely. I can say since we last talked, I have seen Lion King 2 and I would rather sing Lion King 1 again rather than Lion King 2. Yeah.
There's also a lesson in that.
Yes, there is. Look, so much has happened. It's just been a fabulous couple of years and I've been so, it's been really lucky to watch your rise as well collectively in this podcast and beyond. For us, we've really concentrated a lot on how do we get existing evidence into practice. And I think as researchers, we're trained so often to think about what is new, what can we discover that's new. And I think in the area of developmental disability, developmental difference, we know so much already that isn't in practice. And so I've really shifted my my sort of focus, or our collective team's focus, from that discovery phase through to that, what I would see as the more pressing phase of getting existing knowledge into practice more broadly.
Yeah.
So when I last came on, I was talking about the synthesis of evidence. Now, what we did then, there was a huge review.
Yeah.
You know, there were more than 100 different acronyms of interventions, and we tried to basically try and get some sense for families, families of autistic kids, what is evidence-based practice and what is not. That was a research piece. What we've done since is actually going through the process to develop that into a guideline, and now the national guideline for supporting the learning, participation and well-being of autistic kids in Australia has now been published, and that evidence, that synthesis of evidence, is now one recommendation of 84 recommendations within that. And so that is now Australia's first national guideline for what is evidence-based practice in Australia, and so we're working very hard in trying to translate that. Probably the second thing that we've been concentrating on is how do we shake up the clinical pathway for autism in particular. So I've been 20, 25 years now in the field, and even way back then in the sort of late 90s, early noughties, we knew that we could identify little bubs very early showing developmental difference, but our systems haven't been geared up to accept referrals for kids that young. So these kids often bounce from health service to disability service to education service, and then land on someone like my desk at 3, 4, 5 for a diagnosis, and that diagnosis is the commencement for therapy. Meanwhile, all of those fireworks in brain development, we just left them behind. And we've just sort of said, well, they're not important. They are important. And parents talking to us are important when they have concerns. So we've done a whole program of research showing that providing support to little bubs at 12 months of age can actually reduce disability to a really large extent when we assess them at a later age. And that's through an assessment, an intervention called iBasis, and now with a sort of an overarching name of Inklings. And we're now working, luckily enough, it's found to be really clinically effective. Health economics are very strong. So we're working now with the NDIS to roll that out across WA first and then Australia.
Wow.
So it's really pushed us from, we've discovered enough. Now we need to go into, and how do we get it into everyone's hands?
Yeah. Such an important point, because I think, when you talk about the often the gap between families having concerns about their child and, as you said, potentially bouncing around different places and systems to try and get some support for that, early intervention obviously improves outcomes for children, but it also helps to address some of those concerns that the family has as well.
It's a really deep point, Ash, and yes, we can talk about neuroplasticity until the cows come home. It's all true that providing supports very early in life does really capitalise upon those amazing brains that these little bubs have. And, now I'm on the other side of 40, you start to realise how amazing those brains are, because, the rate at which my kids learn words, I'm losing them, But it's more than that. It's number one, when kids interact with the world in a certain way, disability becomes more entrenched, environmentally speaking. Sure. And the other thing is that if we wait until age 3, 4 or 5 to start providing support, families have not just been through the ringer for 2 years. They're not far progressed along that grief, sadness, hope, love, sort of milieu of emotions. And if we get families at 3, 4 or 5, that is the number one to address, is that how do we help parents understand who their bubs are and their kids are, and then help them become really strong agents in their therapy. And if we're doing that at age 3, we're delaying things even more. And so if we can help parents understand their babies, in a really, that parents know their babies, but on a more visceral, deeper emotional level, early on, we actually warm families up to who their little bub is.
I really love that. And I think, a few weeks ago we spoke to Professor Peter Rosenbaum from CanChild, and we talked about this one truth that was centered on the fact that, we need to view the child with their family. And he goes, this seems really obvious, but let's start there. And I said to him, that does seem really obvious. He goes, but it's only obvious when you point it out. so much when we look at, when there is a diagnosis, it's so much about the child and what's going on right there. But when you take a step out and you look at the whole family unit, that's actually where things do need to start. And because it's the family that have come to us first. They're the people who've come to us first. Let's make sure we talk about this from the big, broad perspective rather than just being so specific on the impairments and what it is that you need to try to fix and address. Yeah. It's the whole family unit. And
the strongest most powerful element of our therapies is the love between a parent and their child. If we can harness that in the most positive direction and have nothing come between us, we're 10 steps ahead already.
Yeah. So good. So I guess from there, it sort of leads to this blog post that I read that you had published. And when I read it, everything just resonated so much. It just feels so topical. And I know that, my background very much is in, cerebral palsy, a lot of movement disorders. That's the area that I'm in. But I know you wrote this within the context of a lot of the families that you see, but it really does cross over so much. So I guess the question that you sort of pose is, how much is is too much therapy in a way, but it's a useful question, but you also pose that it might not be a particularly helpful question sometimes as well. Why is that?
It's not a helpful question because it's confusing means and ends, and we're confusing that. And there's a historical angle to this, and indulge me for 30 seconds.
Absolutely.
In the area of autism, and I would dare say it sort of crosses developmental disability more generally, there were these early studies and around what we saw as effective therapies at that time. And essentially the therapies, the mechanism for these therapies, what these therapies were important, but ultimately the main takeaway was the amount of therapy that children received to see positive outcomes. And if we think back to those papers, all we remember in the autism field is 40 hours a week. 40 hours a week. We don't really even remember what type of therapy or how the kids or anything about the kids. I mean, you're just saying, but it's about the 40 hours a week. Then there was a sort of a civil rights fight around, these kids and families really deserve public funding to receive supports. And that centred all around the amount of therapy. And so this idea of 40 hours, which was then scaled back to 20 hours, became this entrenched mantra that families must have 40 hours, must have 20 hours of therapy a week, and that's what the government must pay for. All of which is completely understandable when we see an environment that there was previously of an absolute desert for support. And so the ideas of an hours was a real key catch cry. Then the government responded and we started to get investment. And then we started to say, where did all these mantras come from? And that's my generation.
Because that's a full-time job, 40 hours and a bit of overtime.
It is absolutely that. And it came from a very well-meaning place of we're fighting for rights, but it doesn't actually survive contact with reality. And so what we do still have is that hangover from that time where we do have government support now. I'm not saying it's enough. I'm not saying it's adequate. I'm not saying that it's appropriately targeted, but we do. And I'm old enough now to remember when we had none. And we do have that now. But what we do have is families coming in and almost the first thing they know about support is amount. We must have 20 hours, otherwise our child will not do X, Y, and Z. And it is the wrong question to ask because it is confusing means and ends. It's almost like the amount of therapy is the ends in and of itself rather than the means to achieving an outcome. And so that blog post was 10 years in coming where I've been having these individual conversations. We've now done the research to really conclusively say that there is no set standard number of hours. More doesn't equal better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can say that with genuine, heartfelt clarity, and we need to start to take those views away from parents so they don't feel guilt about them being there because they're not true.
Wow. And I suppose that's, wrapped up in what the evidence tells us. And so I think, before we dive into the specifics in the blog, it might be helpful to reorient our listeners to what we are talking about when we say evidence-based practice around, therapeutic intervention.
Absolutely. I'm so strong on this. And so I trained clinically as a speechy many years ago. I was so useless at that I had to do something very quickly. And so I went into research pretty quickly. Apologies to all the families who I saw. And so as a scientist, people may think that I'm going to sort of say, well, evidence-based practice, go to the literature, will tell you. It's absolutely not what evidence-based practice is, and I'm sure that your listeners would know this. Yeah. It's a tripartite model. It's number one, absolutely the foundation is scientific literature. Yeah. And when we talk about scientific literature, we're saying that under controlled conditions, with all things equal, this seems to be our best bet, our best guess as to how we go forward. Yes. That's all this evidence is that this is our starting point. Yes. But layered on top of that are two key and equal elements. Number one is clinical wisdom. Yep. The wisdom of not just training but have seen families day in, day out for years, months, years, decades. There is wisdom that comes with that. And in terms of best guess, you come with a lot of best guesses based on your previous experience. Yep. And then thirdly, the wisdom that families bring to that context. I can bring all the science that I want, but I do not live their life. I do not know what makes them tick. I don't know what's important in their life. Just as a simple example. I'll finish that thought. It's that tripartite model of research evidence, clinical wisdom, and also the wisdom and context that those families bring. It's only when we get all of that together that we get evidence-based practice.
Yeah. And I think, you mentioned before a phrase that I really cottoned onto and love, surviving contact with reality. Being truly evidence-based in your practice is, I think sometimes we fall into the trap of just, going by what the research evidence tells us because it's, it's there on paper and we can see it and we can try and implement it. But sometimes that doesn't survive contact with reality, right? So it's so important that doesn't just operate in a vacuum, and that you do have those other really important contextual pieces of perspective and input into your practice. Yeah.
So let's say there's a hypothesized world where hours matter. Hours is everything. And we say that there's 10 hours a week that is the best for everyone to get. Okay, what happens if that family requires, as a single parent and that family needs to work? Do you think that parent being able to, stressed out of their brain, take their child out of school to go and receive that amount of therapy is going to be the best for that child? Even in the most simple world, directly following literature is important, but it is not going to actually create the best outcomes. It is an element of three.
Yep, that's right. Yep. What about on the other side, if you've got a lot of clinical wisdom and you're working really closely with families, but the empirical evidence just simply isn't there? How do we talk around that? Because there's probably more instances of that around I can think of already where, it's clinical wisdom, years of practice, being, practicing for 20, 25 years, in your head what you feel works and families are coming to you because of that. Yeah. But it's not trenched in anything there. How would you talk around that?
Look, in the ideal world, those three elements of scientific evidence, clinician wisdom, family wisdom, that they're equal. That's the ideal world. Yeah. In any real world, for any real context, one is going to be larger than the other two, and the two are going to be smaller than one. Yeah. And they have to wax and wane. So there's two. One is a call to arms. We need to understand where there are gaps, and we need to actually go hard at that. Yeah. But what I also don't accept that I think there are elements where when there is not a common truth that we share as clinicians, as families, we start to get into real trouble. And that's where we've come into a bit of trouble with autism, is that people can throw any paper, can throw any personal wisdom forward and say this is the truth. So there are 20 million truths in autism, and this is the purpose of guidelines, where we collectively get down and we say, here is the evidence. There are big evidence gaps, but if we can come to a collective conclusion around what are recommendations that we all say are good, that becomes a truth that we can all hang our hat on. Now, there are also elements of practice where there aren't guidelines, and I think that's probably the call to arms there, is that we need to develop those guidelines so there's a common truth. So I think more broadly, they're equal, those three parts, but in reality they're never equal. But we need to remedy that before we get to the point where there are 20 million truths, and which means there is no truth.
Yeah. Gosh, nicely put. Okay, so going through this blog post now, you laid out 4 clear facts that were really built on like the research evidence over the past 3 decades. So you're really trying to say, what does the research tell us? And your number 1 point was early therapies and supports are important. I love that. Talk us through that.
Oh, it is. It is. But 2 things can be true, and I really want to sort of emphasize these things. We've talked about in terms of our brain unfolds in terms of development, in a really sequential pattern. What develops first is important for what develops second, and those two in combination are important for what develops third. And all of this, so much of this happens within the first year of life. Now, this is absolutely not to say that if we miss those first years of life in terms of providing support that life is over or there's not significant gains to be made. It's just not true. But it means in terms of our bang for buck, that's really where we need to look. And we really need to find ways to identify kids and support them early on, not just for brain development, but as we say, for family growth with their child. But really important to emphasise that by saying that early therapies are important, I am not saying that later therapies are not important, particularly when you go to school, when you go into puberty, when you're going through transitions out of school. We lose kids at every one of those points. And so both are true, and we need to emphasise that, not just in terms of reassuring families that that if you have missed that period, or if that period's over, that there's not huge amounts of growth to happen for your child, but also because we need to maintain a focus on people all throughout their life. Just as I hope someone's focusing on me.
That's right.
Yeah, because, children grow and change, and their goals and what they want to get out of life and what their family wants to get out of life, that evolves and changes as well. So it's only natural that, therapy has an important role to play at each of those stages of growth and development. It
does, and it just becomes different. So, for example, providing support, therapeutic support in that first year of life, whether it be, the physical support that Healthy Strides provides, or whether it's sort of more behavioural type support that my organisation, Clinic Kids, provides, it absolutely will see significant learning, development, participation, but that is no more important than making a smooth transition to school. My goodness, we change people's lives if they have a smooth transition to school. And so we're just talking about different changes, different supports.
And I think within the whole context of therapy as well, we often, I think sometimes the picture of therapy is this sort of, one-on-one, what that might look like, but it's also, advice and guidance that all goes together, doesn't it? Like it's the support you provide within those sessions to the families.
Completely.
During those times.
And, the sort of the sort of clinical and therapeutic sort of gains that truly make me tear up when I think about them is, those first moments, or when they say mum or dad for the first time, oh my God, you sort of, you're in raptures for that family, but it's also those families' breakthroughs in terms of how much they, those moments where they sit down and they have these realizations of the amount of love that they have for their child and what they would do for their child to support them no matter what, even though it is bloody hard sometimes, that they are breakthroughs.
I love that.
Yeah. So the second point, which I think we've kind of we've touched on and talked about a little bit so far, is that there's no standard amount of therapy. So let's just talk a bit again, just to kind of reiterate that point, the link or lack thereof between, the amount of therapy and outcomes.
They're again, in the autism field in particular, it was a 40 hours per week maximum, and minimum, and then it was sort of shaped down to 20 hours a week. I'm loath to criticise the sort of origins of this. It came from a sort of a public campaign that we deserve support, we deserve public funding. It's also wrong. In terms, clinically wrong in terms of that there is a set number of hours that all children should receive, which leads to best outcomes. That's just not how humans work. And also, of course, when we're talking about that amount of hours, 40 hours a week is actually more than the Labor Day wage, hourly wage of 37 and a half in Australia, hours per week, and even 20 hours. And they are intensive supports but it came from a well-meaning origin, but we really have to tell families that this is not just outdated, it is actively incorrect.
Yeah, sure.
And that the moment that we can say to families there is scientific evidence that this was not just not true now, but never true, that we can start to relieve some of that guilt and we can actually start to tear away myths so we can actually start to see who that child is.
Yeah. And when I looked at this point, I was drawn to our conversations that we've had around the F words.
Yeah.
And, how when you're doing, that sheer volume of therapy, are we taking those F words into consideration? Are we thinking about family? Are we thinking about fun? Are we thinking about,
friends,
future, all those things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've talked before about this concept of, you don't do therapy to get really good at doing therapy. You're doing therapy so that you can, take those periods of growth and use them in context, and that context is not therapy.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that's the whole means and the ends, like you were saying before again, right? It's just ours, I guess, sometimes can be so tangible. And I guess the next point you'd made, which is pretty related here, is, more doesn't necessarily mean it's better.
Yes.
And I guess from there, your next point, which was, again, because your lovely train of thought as we follow it through, is that, quality is as important as quantity. And I thought that would be a good place for us to kind of linger there a little bit in terms of what quality actually means.
Absolutely. Just very briefly on the more doesn't equal better. This is, I think that we're over the line with there's no set standard number of hours.
Yeah.
We're not over the line in terms of families' views around more doesn't equal better.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely prepared to go with more equals better until I really set to go into the literature and try to understand what are we seeing. Is there any evidence on the most controlled conditions where families put their lives on hold to see does more equal better? And the reality, and this was this synthesis of evidence that we talked about last time, the reality is it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that there is no strong correlation at all between the number of hours a child receives and the therapeutic outcomes they have. Now, this doesn't mean that there's not a minimum number of hours that is likely to be important for a child. Of course, we need to work with each other in order to get better, progress towards any outcome. But there is no consistent, uniform, and even moderate correlation between the amount of hours one child receives and the outcomes across all children. The point I want to make here is that families, totally understandably, I get it on a very personal level, want to put as many hours to come and see a speechy or a physio or an OT as possible. Of course we do. Of course we do. My really tangible point here is that time, emotional effort, attention, these are actually zero-sum games. I have tried as much as I can to put more time into my days, but unfortunately 24 hours and however many seconds is actually the limit. And so if you're wanting to jam that one more hour in, you are going to have to take something away from your life.
Yeah.
And I want families to have that discussion with me to say that if you're coming to see me, it better bloody well be worth it.
Yeah.
And so what are you taking out of your lives? On a personal level, there's something in our family. Our family has a bit of a routine on Sunday mornings. We go down and get a croissant. Okay, all right. Well, I'll go down and get a croissant, get coffees, bring them back.
Love it.
Yeah.
We all sit down. It all gets messy. One child hits another. It all ends up in crying, and and I make everyone enjoy it. God damn it, enjoy it.
What a beautiful way to spend a Sunday morning.
But it's a family routine. Now, if we had therapeutic intervention that was suggested to us for an hour on a Sunday morning, we'd need to take that out. I would say to myself, I don't think that's worth it, because this is a really important part of our family culture. Now, what is part of the family culture that we're compromising in terms of therapy? And that is a constant negotiation between, and a really open negotiation between us and families. And families should really understand what are the active ingredients of their culture. So quality.
I love it.
So, and this is a point around hours to the neglect of what's happening in those hours. We're driven in systems all around the world through activity-based type funding, which means that how many hours do you have, and you get paid on that amount of hours. And that has led services to essentially jam as many hours as we can into a clinical workday, which obviously has horrendous effects on clinicians in terms of burnout. You know, clinical work is a grind at the best of times. We love it. We adore it. It's also a grind, you know. It's hard. And so I see clinicians all the time with 8 hours back to back to back to back. I'm not too sure that seventh or eighth client is going to get as higher quality support, which means thought going into the session, which means the planning of the session. It means talking with everyone around that child prior to that session, engagement, alertness, critical analytical skills during the session. Because we're humans. There is no way we can do that in the 7th or 8th hour, let alone on the 5th, 10th, 15th day of that. And so that's what I'm talking with quality. We need our systems to recognise that quality is the thought that goes into it, the analytical skills that go after it is just as important, if not more important, than as many hours that children come in to see us.
And I suppose on a slightly more macro level, if that is your schedule and every minute of every day is full of, you know, patient-facing activity, that takes time away from professional development, from, you know, staying across what really is important. Current evidence, capacity building, all those kinds of activities which make your practice richer. You don't get the opportunity to do that either.
You said it. It's exactly that, is that our among our biggest assets that we can bring to a therapeutic session is our energy, is our knowledge, and our ability to utterly adore that child in front of us and want the best. We're also human, and we have finite buckets. And so we do need that, but we also have to continue replenishing that. And I completely agree that supervision, just the simple act of supervision, having someone to talk to, having someone to go over your practice, that will absolutely enrich the next 5 days of your practice. And if we're not having any time for that, let alone the energy sapping skills of eight hours back to back, we've just missed a trick. And I think our systems have also fallen into that more is better.
So what does maintaining quality look like then in an ideal setting? What I suppose processes or systems or, you know, things should we be having in place to make sure that we're maintaining quality in what we're doing?
That's a good one.
Really recommend listeners go and look at our national guideline for supporting the learning, participation and wellbeing of autistic kids, and I'm more than happy to send that on to the podcast. It provides very clear guidance as to how we build things in around our sessions to make sure that those 45 minutes, that hour in it, is the very best it can. Doesn't mean that disasters don't happen. That's therapy. That's therapy.
Roll with the punches.
But it actually builds in ways that we can learn from that. That family also learns from that, and then we can also make sure the next one's better. So time, you know, we're talking an ideal world here. We need to build in time before and after sessions where we can, number one, prior to the session, set up the room appropriately, talk to other clinicians involved, understand what happened in that week for that family, just even simple things like that, as well as what happened in that previous session, what goals may have changed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then also building 15 minutes after, at the very least, to critically analyse that. And of course, you've got all those other things around supervision. I cannot recommend that enough in terms of just someone to say to you, you're doing okay.
Yeah.
Not you're doing bad. You can improve. That's also very helpful, but you're doing okay.
Yeah.
And so obviously professional development. So many clinicians that come to speak to me are still using evidence from 20, 30 years ago, and that is not their fault. That's because they have no time to actually get up and trained on modern day understanding. But in the area of autism, and no doubt cerebral palsy and other areas of developmental disability, it is unrecognisable 20 years ago to what it is now. And so it's time. It's time, and we need to pay for that time.
Yeah. Oh, so good. Totally all feel very much richer after these conversations. And I guess so moving on now from those points, you said the better question to perhaps ask is, how much is the right amount of therapy for my child and family right now? I can see why you've landed there as a better question, but let's flesh that one out a bit, because I think that's a really good question to be asking, I guess.
It really goes to the individualisation, is that you as a child, you as a family bring a child at a certain time of life where you know all of the various prevailing winds and headwinds that are going on in your life at that moment. Absolutely, we need to set plans in terms of what goals we work on, and then which is the end, and then set the means to achieve that amount, setting, mode, the context, but we need to come in with an understanding that what we're doing is our best guess for now, based on all of the factors that I know, that I come in with as a clinician, and you come in as a family. And so it really sets the tone that that there are goals that we're seeking to achieve, and all ours is the means to achieve them.
The other point I really enjoyed, probably because it's not intuitive to a lot of people, but sometimes we have to slow down to speed up. Can you talk us through, what you mean by that?
Absolutely. This might be a little bit contradictory for people who haven't worked clinically. It is the easiest trap in the world, particularly when there is a sort of a small, we have a time window of funding for families to do back-to-back blocks of therapy sessions. Okay, finish this one, let's go to the next one, let's go to the next one, let's go to the next one. And we do not take the time, because often we don't have it, to sit down and think, is this the best time, this next block of therapy for this family right now? There are times when actually having a term off, so a 10-week block off, is the very best for them, because they are able to go and participate in footy, or they are able to go sing in the choir, or they are able to actually just go home and just slob around, be a kid. And I am incredibly, one of the sort of, in that latest guideline that we published, one of the I think the most important recommendations we had in terms of the guiding principles of therapy is to honour childhood. Now, I realise I'm talking about kids here, but I think this is probably just on a humanhood. We often give little kids full-time jobs because of the kids that we see therapeutically, and so much of the time, I'd say the majority of the time, that is a bargain worth taking. But they are kids first and foremost. They have to have a childhood full of being inquisitive, full of play, full of boredom. All the things that we had. I'm hearing the Karate Kid music. And so taking that time to think, is this the best thing for this family right now? More often than not, we'll say, it is. But we need to have that honest conversation. We need to provide the space in which an honest conversation to say that you can come back to us. Right now, what's important is that you guys do this with your family.
It's that reassurance point as well. I think when there are wait lists around, sometimes people don't want to lose that session with their therapist at that particular time. It's just being able to, again, look at your practice and see how you can shape things so you can have opportunities for that, so people aren't sort of driven by more fear of losing their session time. But the other part of it is, what I always see is you just sometimes need time to percolate and for those skills to develop. Like anyone who's learnt an instrument before will know that you'll practice, and sometimes you go, I've had enough of this now. You just leave it for a bit. You come back a few weeks later and you're like, oh my goodness, it's so much better. there are times where you just like time is an element. It's an active ingredient for skills sometimes to develop and to generalize into real life context.
Yeah, that opportunity to consolidate. Which, you know, with my motor learning hat on, that's a really important stage.
It actually really is
motor skill development, but that's I think that's applicable to.
It's an active therapy. You know, even though you're not in therapy, it's a good way to be able to think about what that time means.
Such a great point, and it's one I wouldn't have thought to bring up. But I just think it's so true, and certainly what we see, for example, in those baby therapies that we were talking about before, we provide this support, this therapeutic support at 12 months of age for 5 months. Immediately following therapy, we see small gains. When we see them again at age 3, so 2 years later, that's where the really large gains emerge. And what's happened in between? Development. The kids have got older. And so those small changes we can make early on actually can go to larger changes at that end. And we have to keep that in mind as we go through our therapy, that perhaps those therapy gains we're not seeing right now, but they will be consolidated over time.
That's right. It's appreciating that there is the fact that children are always developing and there is such thing as maturation. Sometimes I think it's really easy to forget that maturation does occur. We've got to be so careful. I don't think we intend to do it, but, you know, for therapists not to take credit for the child maturing sometimes. Like when there is just the element of just maturation, you know, and timing when things might happen, it's
spot on.
There's a lot more thought around that, isn't there? A question I had about that element of slowing down as well relates to kind of NDIS sort of funding sometimes. And I hear this all the time when they go, I've got all this time funded. I have to use it all. Otherwise I won't get the same next time, or I'll get less. And there is this, you know, you get your fund plan, you're really happy with it because you've advocated for it for so much, probably paid a lot of money to get that funding. And then you've got to use it all. There's that sense of, you know, that sort of more sometimes comes from that. Have you experienced
use it or
that?
lose it?
That kind of thing, which is a really tough driver because you're constantly working at it. You know, there's no pause.
Oh, completely. And we're, you know, I'm talking here in this absolute vacuum and pretending to be naive of systems that drive us into different practices. And people don't develop these practices in a vacuum. They are driven that way in terms of how they can make ends meet. And the reality is, if you're doing disability really well, you barely break even, you know, because it is hands-on, it is it's hands-on and really time investment. And so heavy on the time investment. Yes, we do have definite funding structure issues when it comes to actually aligning to best practice. I think part of this is because in Australia, our National Disability Insurance Scheme was developed at a time in which we didn't have clear guidance as to what is best practice. And so hours of therapy, activity was seen as the be-all and end-all. And you get this activity, you will, you know, by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age, you will show X gains. We obviously know that is not how it works. We know that's not how humans work. It may help systems, it may help computer systems, but it does not actually survive contact with reality, as we say. So yes, absolutely, there are systems driving to this. I think that we will start to see changes over the next couple of years with regards to this, because the spectre of losing funding is a real fear that we all fear, both on the clinician side as well as the family side. And we should be celebrating. I mean, I genuinely mean this with their family. We should be celebrating therapeutic gains, and when families can actually use other systems other than the NDIS. Because, but unfortunately, it's not how the system has been designed, and we need those broader community supports to ensure that that's actually reality.
So, Andrew, the final points from the blog, I think we've touched on the fact that therapy needs change over time, and we've acknowledged that is, you know, that is real, and that is something that we need to take into consideration with the families that we're working with. But something we haven't covered yet is the fact that therapy time extends to connection with the community. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think, you know, this aligns really nicely with the F words that we've talked about earlier on. But what do you mean by that?
It's means and ends. What's the ends of what we're trying to achieve? You know, I walk through Healthy Strides and I see all of these amazing things happening, and I think, well, what's the ends of that? And the ends is that kids can engage with the community in the way that they want to. And that's the ends that we want, that they can engage in community, engage in society, engage in relationships in the way that they want to.
Yeah.
And that means that we need to have that as practice all the time. You can't suddenly turn on a community tap and expect everyone to be there. So again, it comes down to that bargain. If a family is going to spend 1 hour with me, is that better than being at school? Number one. Sometimes it's not. Is it better than going to footy practice, even if that's really hard, but they still get to see those people they know at school? Is it better than going for an ice cream with your folks? Is it better than being bored at home? They will all have different answers for different families, but sometimes the answer will be, no, it's not better. And so when we're talking about engaging with the community, it's not, oh, well, they need a time off. It's actually, well, this is actually the ends through which what we're trying to achieve. And that should be a celebrated element of therapy. So I think it all comes down to that bargain. Is an hour with me worth more than an hour elsewhere? And often it'll be no.
I think the other element as well is that therapy, for some families who perhaps do a lot of therapy, that is quite a safe space for them, and that community connection can be quite confronting. So, what happens in that instance where that idea of connecting with community is quite overwhelming or just feels too much for families?
I totally agree with that, and it is scary. It's scary at the best of times. We're all slightly anxious about engaging with people we don't know and engaging in a new community. It's just so happens that the payoff, if it all works out, is amazing, and so that's why we do it, as well as pressure. But nevertheless, how do we do it? Well, number one, we start early, and so that's not helping the families you're talking about. But I would absolutely recommend we start engaging in play groups, engaging in community groups as early as we can. That doesn't mean that you need to rush out and join the suburban choir. What it means is that that the opportunities that arise to you, don't hide your light under a bushel. Our society at the moment is so much more accepting, so much more understanding, so much more caring about developing friendships and relationships with you, and they will love your child just as equally as you do. For families who have felt nervous about doing it and are now sort of thinking about doing it, like everything in life, it is just experience, and you just got to try it once. You will find almost inevitably that the world doesn't cave in, even if it goes badly, and sometimes it does. I have it with my own kids, let me tell you. The amount of times I've walked out of Woolworths with a child surfboarded under my arm, and thinking,
but you can't eat all the yogurt pouches that are sitting in the fridge at Woolworths.
Totally the same. Totally the same. But you know what? The people you want to hang out with don't give a fig, and so it's experience. It's giving it a shot in a supported environment and seeing that the world doesn't end. It's brave. What do we want to teach our kids? Ultimately, for us in our own household, it's being brave and kind. Kindness in another, trouble, courage in one's own. And that's what it comes down to with these things. And ultimately, we as a community are here to help you.
And so I think therapists have a really important role to play in having those conversations with families and supporting families to kind of dip their toe into that community environment, don't they? If therapy feels like the safe space, then the therapist has an active role to play in supporting them in that.
I love that, Ash. I totally agree. Totally agree. That's absolutely part of our job.
100%. I think thinking beyond our walls is actually really, really important. Always context. One of the programs we're sort of really trying to run this year is to translate a lot of that within community environments and libraries, and actually just helping them to make that link. And we're there to help them for that sort of first initial time, which might feel a little bit scary. And then eventually, once you've got the confidence for that, you'll fly. And that's the kind of support. I love it. Well, gosh, that was a good conversation.
It was.
Ed, it's nearly your turn. Are you ready?
We'll find out.
Well, here I go into the Tell It to Ed segment. As you know, Ed is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening. He's been pushing buttons and sliding up and down faders, that kind of thing. Listening intently to the conversations.
And thinking.
And thinking. Yeah. I think I saw a pen, at some point, maybe writing some notes. All right, Andrew, here's your opportunity to give about a 60-second pitch or so to Ed. And Ed, you'll have a chance for a question. All right, take it away, Andrew.
Okay, Ed, I'm glad you've been listening. Look, early therapies and supports are so important to how we can best capitalise on early childhood and help families understand their children right from the earliest moment. I think we've got into a sort of a culture of thinking that more therapy equals better outcomes always. And the reality is that I've done the deep dive in the research and I can absolutely say that that's not true. In fact, it's really incorrect. What we absolutely know is that early therapies are important, but it must meet the needs of the child and the family at that time. So how do we get there? The way that we get there is by me bringing, or the clinician bringing the wisdom and the experience of their training, is by us understanding what therapies and supports are relevant and what does the science say about what is most important for that child, and then the family bringing all of that context to say that this is important for us right now. And from that, there will be a collision of wisdom. I don't have all the answers. They don't have all the answers. Together we do. And when we bring that together, we'll actually understand what is the most appropriate amount of supports, which supports, and for now. And that's a small short-term outcome, and then we'll review that after a little bit. But the key thing is that everyone has wisdom and that you can bring that, combine it together, and together that's where the magic happens.
Oh, so good. Very good. Very, very good. All right, Ed, are you ready? Your turn for a question.
So, Andrew, I've loved having you on the show. You're immensely eloquent with how you kind of describe evidence-based practice and you make it really digestible for people like myself. There's been some great practical tips for clinicians. And I know that throughout the whole conversation, like time has kind of been a key component that's kind of tied all these elements together. And whilst I think I've followed really well, and obviously there's still a lot of work in education and all the rest of it to do in this field, my question was about the 40 and the 20 hours that you were speaking of earlier. And I'm just wondering, is there a falsehood that's kind of prevailed about maximising the neuroplastic responses when kids are really, really young? And how that might have a greater impact versus later on in life. And, do families hear the F word mantra throughout their therapy journey, but then get stuck in a routine? Like, is there some element of re-education that kind of needs to be had with families about what they do in those very early years?
Yeah. Great question, Ed. You have been listening. Thank you. Yes, there does. I think there needs to be one of the most important sort of movements that's happened in the last couple of decades has really been around neurodiversity and the idea that all kids are beautiful just how they come into the world. Mm. Some kids are also born with additional barriers, and it's actually our job not to change who they are as humans, but actually remove the barriers from their life so they can be whoever they want to be. Mm. And that's the re-education that I think that we're it's not the re-education, it's actually the education of families at the point that they identify their bubs developing a bit differently. Mm. There's a natural reaction to sort of say, oh, how do we get this away? How do we get this away? Mm. What we've actually changed with our therapies over the last 30, 40 years, this is the royal we, this is everyone, is away from how do we stop that child being this disordered child to actually how do we remove barriers so they can actually be who they want to be. Mm. And it turns out through all of our clinical trials, if we lean into neurodiversity and change our environments to meet the needs and how they develop, not only are therapeutic interventions more effective, families understand their children more, and actually fewer supports are required. Now, that doesn't mean that the child won't experience further barriers, but it absolutely means that we can appreciate the child for who they are and the family can fly with them.
Yeah.
Great.
That was good. Great. Wonderful. Yeah. No, I think I'm speechless.
Yeah.
Ash.
I was just thinking about how applicable that is to, all of the children that we work with.
That's right.
Not just those with autism.
Aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky?
Yeah, we really are. Well, great question, Ed. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It's, we know how busy you are, but we appreciate so much the time you carve out to have a chat with us. And we know that all of our listeners are going to really love listening to this episode as well. So remember, to all of our listeners out there, if you want to have links to this blog in particular or any other information about today's show,
and the guidelines.
Guidelines as well. We'll pop them all in there, researchworks.net. All the links will be there. And of course, there's a CBD form there that you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as a part of your record of your PD requirements. But once again, thank you so much, Andrew.
Yeah, it's so much fun. Thank you for having me.
We hope you'll come back again.
Yes.
Because we will be inviting you back again.
Three-peat.
Yeah, that's right. Have a great week, everyone. We'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.